Okay, some of you guys might remember that a few episodes ago I did a top 10 things you didn't know about The Matrix, where I explained that Will Smith was offered the role of Neo but turned it down to star in Wild Wild West instead, and made a joke about how he definitely chose the wrong movie. Well, believe it or not, but in the comments section I got quite a few comments from people saying, "Oi, Minty, what are you talking about? The Wild Wild West was good." Yeah, that happened. Ah yes, Wild Wild West, the 1999 comedy western which is kind of known in the mainstream for being notoriously awful. The movie where Will Smith plays James West and Kevin Kline plays Artemis Gordon. Two US Marshals who have to stop an evil genius called Dr. Loveless, played by Kenneth Branagh, while teaming up with a young lady called Rita, played by Selma Hayek. It's weird and wacky and full of loud special effects and gadgets along with oddball humour, and didn't exactly go down too well when it was released. But the comments that I got in my Matrix video by fans of this movie got me wondering if I was too harsh on Wild Wild West. After all, there are movies that are well known for being awful that I saw as a kid which I love, like Superman 3 and Supergirl, of which that love has transpired into my adult years. So could that be the case for Wild Wild West, and that now I'm the old man saying that that film was rubbish, while children who grew up watching it still have a love for it? Well, today we are going to try and find out. I like to think that my show is all about giving movies a fair go, by looking into them objectively to see if these movies have any redeeming qualities. So today we are going to look into 10 things that you didn't know about Wild Wild West. Let's check it out. Number 10. Origins of Wild Wild West. Wild Wild West is based on a TV show of the same name that ran on CBS from 1965 to 1969. Just like the movie, it's set in the Old West and it follows US Marshals James West and Artemis Gordon, who go on adventures to stop evil villains and wrongdoers. Now, I would love to say, oh yeah, I remember this show, and it had this in it, and it had that in it, but truth be told, I've never actually seen it before. But from research I've done, the premise of the show was that it was the Western genre mixed in with the spy genre, which became popular in the 60s thanks to James Bond, along with science fiction elements sprinkled in for good measure. The show was quite popular for its time, and it wasn't cancelled through lack of ratings, but because the show was considered quite violent for the time it was made in. And in 1968 there was a push to limit violence on TV after the real-life assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So real-life tragedy was the show's downfall, but the show very much appeared to be a product of the time it was made in, the 1960s. The question is, how would that transpire into the 90s for the Generation X audience? Number 9, it was going to be directed by Richard Donner. In 1992, Warner Bros. Bought the rights to the Wild Wild West TV show with the intention to release a theatrical movie based on the show. A script was written by Lethal Weapon and Last Action Hero writer Shane Black, and Superman the movie director Richard Donner came on board to direct the movie, who incidentally also directed Lethal Weapon. Donner also had a history with the Wild Wild West TV show, having directed 3 episodes of the series, and Mel Gibson was cast to play the dashing James West. However, both Donner and Gibson abandoned the Wild Wild West movie to work on Maverick instead, which, like Wild Wild West, is a comedy western based on an old TV series. I guess reviving old comedy western TV shows was really on demand during the 90s. Then the part of James West went to Tom Cruise, but he also bailed out of the project to star in Mission Impossible instead. Once again, another movie based on a TV show from the 60s. Number 8, giving the project a new coat of paint. Writers S.S. Wilson and Brent Maddock, who are best known for writing Short Circuit and Tremors, wrote a new script for Wild Wild West, and their script was then rewritten by Who Framed Roger Rabbit writers Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman. And in 1997, Will Smith and director Barry Sonnenfeld were approached to helm the movie, with Sonnenfeld directing and Will Smith starring as James West, of which, as mentioned, Smith turned down starring as Neo in The Matrix to star in Wild Wild West. Sonnenfeld and Smith were no doubt chosen as in 1997 the director and actor made the Men in Black movie, which was a big hit, mixing science fiction action with comedy, along with plenty of fun aliens and special effects thrown into the mix. So Smith and Sonnenfeld would have seemed like a sure win. Incidentally, Sonnenfeld had previously directed the two Addams Family movies. Once again, a movie based on, you guessed it, a TV show from the 60s. Seriously, all these movies from the 90s based on 1960s TV shows. I can't keep up with them all. Number 7. Then George Clooney was cast in the movie. So with Will Smith firmly cast in the role of James West, the question is who could play the other half of the Wild Wild West team, Artemis Gordon. Several actors were considered, including Johnny Depp and Matthew McConaughey. However, George Clooney was cast in the role. This is because Clooney was originally cast in fellow Warner Bros. Movie Jack Frost, but he dropped out and was replaced by fellow Batman Michael Keaton. So Clooney did a switcheroo and was cast in Wild Wild West instead. However, Clooney then walked out of Wild Wild West because he and director Sonnenfeld felt that he just wasn't right for the role. After all, Artemis Gordon is meant to be an eccentric, absent-minded inventor, whereas Clooney is more of a cool, slick, heroic guy. And both Clooney and Sonnenfeld felt that it wouldn't be right to change the character to be more suited to Clooney's persona. So Clooney was out and Kevin Kline was in, who starred in a double role of Artemis Gordon and the President of the United States. So finally, the production had its James West and Artemis Gordon, in the form of Will Smith and Kevin Kline. Number 6. Recycled Superman Spider. Wild Wild West was produced by John Peters, who had previously produced other hit movies like An American Werewolf in London, Inner Space, Flashdance, and the 1989 Batman, to name but just a few. However, before working on the Wild Wild West movie, Peters was producing the infamous unmade Superman movie, Superman Lives, which was to focus on the death and return of Superman and was to star Nicolas Cage as the Man of Steel. Writer and director Kevin Smith said that when he was attached to writing Superman Lives, Peters was insistent that there must be a scene involving a giant spider. And yeah, it's kind of famous now how much Peters really wanted that giant spider. However, Superman Lives was cancelled, and alas, in Wild Wild West, Peters finally got to live his dream and put his big spider on screen in the form of the mechanical steampunk spider seen in Wild Wild West. Incidentally, Peters' love for giant spiders didn't end there, as comic book writer and artist Neil Gaiman claims that at one point there were talks of a Sandman movie with John Peters producing, with Peters requesting, yeah, you've guessed it, a giant spider. But to be fair though, as easy as it is to laugh and to poke fun at the spider in Wild Wild West, it still actually looks pretty cool. Now I can remember watching the movie for the first time, and to me, the spider was the highlight of the movie. Number 5. Drastically changing one of the villains. In Wild Wild West, British actor Kenneth Branagh plays the movie's main villain, Dr. Loveless, an evil genius who is amputated from the waist down, who goes around in a steampunk wheelchair. In the original series, there was an antagonist called Dr. Loveless, but he was considerably different to how he is seen in the movie. As in the TV series, Loveless wasn't an amputee victim, but rather he was a little person. Another major difference between the show and movie is the relationship between James West and Artemis Gordon. In the show, the two main heroes have a strong friendship, and it felt more like a team working together, whereas in the movie, their friendship felt more antagonistic, with them being more rivals than team players, constantly trying to outdo one another and getting frustrated with each other. Now this is subjective on my part, but I always felt that Smith and Kline didn't have the best on-screen chemistry. I mean, they, to me, came across as being slightly irritated with one another. Now maybe that's because they were meant to have a prickly relationship, but if you go back to Men in Black, Agent J and K could often have friction and disagreements, but Smith and Tommy Lee Jones still had amazing chemistry with each other, and had a spark that I just didn't see with Smith and Kline. Number 4. The music of Wild Wild West. The musical score of Wild Wild West was composed by movie scoring legend Elmer Bernstein. Bernstein had been scoring movies since the 1950s, and during the late 70s and 80s he had scored many comedy movies like Animal House, Airplane, and Ghostbusters. The irony of having Bernstein on board to score the movie is that he previously scored one of the most famous westerns of all time, The Magnificent Seven in 1960. The score he provides for Wild Wild West is fun and adventurous enough. Not one of his greatest works, but it's okay. His music in the movie even incorporates the score from the TV show, which was composed by Richard Markowitz, of whom wasn't credited in the movie's credits for being the original composer of the theme. Just as with Men in Black, Will Smith released a song for Wild Wild West, also called Wild Wild West. It was a fun hip-hop song. The song became a #1 hit in the Billboard charts, and from memory, this song was everywhere. It was constantly being played on TV and the radio, but it seems that not everyone was a fan of it, as it won a Razzie for Worst Original Song. Damn. Well, them the breaks, I guess. Well, I still liked it. Number 3, action figures. Yeah, believe it or not, but there was an action figure lineup of Wild Wild West to coincide with the movie's release. Now, these action figures were not as well known as, say, the action figures based on the Batman movies from the 90s or the Star Wars ones, but they were there. The Wild Wild West figures were incidentally released by Warner Brothers themselves. I think something that lets the lineup down is the packaging. It doesn't stand out and looks very blue, compared to the movie's poster which actually uses earthly colours. So it doesn't look very Wild Wild West-ish. The figures themselves look great, especially the James West one, which perfectly captures Will Smith's likeness. In fact, despite the lackluster packaging, I would say that these figures were really underrated. Except for Dr. Loveless. I get that they were trying to recreate his wheelchair spider legs, but it kind of looks like a man with long legs doing some kind of squatting pose. There was also larger scale doll-sized figures of Wild Wild West too, but the toys associated to Wild Wild West slipped into obscurity. Number 2, double rating in Australia. The Australian release of Wild Wild West saw an anomaly of which I have never seen before or since, in which Wild Wild West was given 2 ratings, as it was rated both PG and M15. PG meaning all ages can watch the movie but parental guidance is recommended, and M15 meaning that the movie is not for people under the age of 15. So, it's a little confusing, right? The movie's rating is literally saying the movie is for all ages, while also at the same time saying people under 15 can't watch it. So, like, how did this happen? Well, if you look closely at the M15 rating, it says in small print in SA only, meaning South Australia. I guess when the movie came out in Australia, all the other states agreed that the movie was a PG, but South Australia didn't agree and had to be difficult and felt that the movie should be an M, which led to 2 ratings. I guess if you were under the age of 15 in 1999 and lived in South Australia and wanted to see Wild Wild West, the only way you could do so was to cross the border and watch it in another state. But seriously though, was this really necessary? The movie is totally a PG. Come on, South Australia, fix this up. But seriously, look, the movie has got 2 ratings. Isn't that weird? But then again, that's what I'm here for, to point out all these weird things. Number 1, a wild disappointment. Wild Wild West was released in June 1999 and made just over $222 million on a $170 million budget. So although it recouped its money, it was still considered a major disappointment, not bringing in anywhere near as much as anticipated. Wild Wild West was also heavily criticised by critics, mainly for its comedy, with it being noted that the movie tries to be funny but just isn't, with loud and bombastic effects thrown in there to no effect. Roger Ebert called it a comedy dead zone. The movie even won a string of Razzie Awards, of which Robert Conrad, who played James West in the TV show, accepted the Razzie Awards as a public way of expressing his displeasure of the movie. Even Will Smith in later years would be quite critical of Wild Wild West and doesn't really seem to have any love for it. So this leads to the as mentioned comments I got about Wild Wild West in my Matrix episode and some of the love that fans seem to have for it. Well, I guess you could say it's just a fun, wacky adventure movie. It's a harmless western spoof with plenty of eye-candy special effects. So I guess if you saw Wild Wild West at the right age in 1999, then it may have been something that you would have really enjoyed, and thus that love has transpired into adulthood. But it's always forever marked as a strange chapter in Hollywood. That time that Will Smith starred in that weird comedy western movie with the giant spider. A quirky film that people probably didn't really understand when it came out, and probably still don't now, and probably don't really have any interest in trying to. But all its obscure weirdness is there to enjoy and indulge in, for all those who love obscure cinema. I mean, there are some things to like about Wild Wild West. Will Smith's charm and charisma definitely does help, and I do like the steampunk style of the movie. But for me personally, yeah, look, the movie just isn't for me. But if anyone says that they love Wild Wild West, then I won't try to argue that or take that away from them. After all, it's based on a feeling, and a feeling is just that, a feeling. And if that's how people feel, then it can't be denied. And if someone saw the movie for the first time as a child, then I can understand them loving it and still loving it now. For outsiders, the Wild Wild West is more of a curious watch. If anything, just to see a big blockbuster movie that failed, of which sometimes viewing such movies can be fun, especially if you have a few beers to digest it with. Anyway, I'm Minty, and remember, it is okay to disagree. We don't all have to love the same movies. Otherwise, that would lead to pretty boring conversation. See ya!